All of us in this room have something in common. All of us have experienced trauma. Trauma has touched each one of us, or someone close to us has been traumatized. So what can be done about this? How do we heal ourselves? How do we help others heal? For some who have been traumatized, professional help is required and is the answer. But what about the rest of us? What about those of us who don't necessarily require professional attention, but seek healing for ourselves and in relationship to others? I believe that the STAR model provides an answer to this dilemma. STAR is the acronym for Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience. It is a 5-day academic and experiential education training that came to life in the days following September 11th, 2001, as a joint venture between Church World Service and the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. STAR encompasses principles of conflict transformation, human security, trauma healing and resilience, restorative justice, and broadly defined spirituality that provide a compass towards reconciliation. From the beginning, STAR has brought together people from a variety of religious traditions and civil society leaders from around the world. The STAR workshop was developed to embrace the challenge of responding to the inevitable traumas of life in a way that leads to personal and societal transformation. I believe that we must find alternatives to the destructive cycles of victimhood and violence. I also believe the principles presented in the STAR training allow us to work together to find a better way. In our brief time together, I'd like to share with you how I discovered STAR and its relevance to everyday life. I will explain the basic principles, concepts, and models of STAR. I will share who can benefit from participation in the 5-day STAR training. And I will share a little bit about the June 2010 workshop in Minneapolis and our future plans for STAR in the Twin Cities. But before I share specifics about STAR, I'd like to tell you a few stories that illustrate how chronic stress and trauma can impact individuals and groups. In my work as a neuropsychologist, I see youth and adults who have neurological as well as psychological disorders. At an epilepsy clinic in St. Paul, I see patients who have behaviors that look like epilepsy, but in fact are not seizures caused by electrical discharges in the brain. These are called non-epileptic events, or NEEs. And they're typically the result of intense high levels of stress, enduring chronic stress, multiple sources of lower level chronic stress over a long period of time, or a history of trauma. NEEs are psychologically based seizure-like episodes. The first experience I had of NEEs was a clinical case that I saw during my internship year at the University of Minnesota Hospital. The patient was a 16-year-old girl who, for our purposes today, I will call Lee. Lee had what was called drop attack seizures. They are called drop attacks because that is exactly what happens. For no apparent reason, the person unpredictably drops to the ground unconscious. This type of episode is quite rare. Lee had these unpredictable episodes during school and at home and while engaging in recreation, like playing tennis. She was in the hospital for 24-hour EEG monitoring of her brain's electrical discharge to record one of these seizures. As the neuropsychology intern on call that day, Lee's neurologist asked me to meet with her to try to figure out what was going on with her. I met with Lee bedside for about 45 minutes. I asked her all sorts of questions about her life at home and at school and with friends and family. After building some rapport, I asked Lee some more sensitive questions. I asked Lee if she had any memories of being sexually or physically abused. Lee answered me with a simple yes. I then asked Lee to share with me any part of that she felt comfortable sharing. Lee told me that she had been sexually abused by an adult male worker at the orphanage where she had lived before she was adopted. Lee told me that the only person she had ever shared about that abuse was her twin sister, and they had sworn each other to secrecy, not knowing what would happen if they told anyone. And they never did until now. Immediately after Lee said that last phrase about the secret, she lost consciousness and fell into a deep sleep. There was no indication of seizure activity on her EEG monitor. Lee had had a non-epileptic event because of her history of trauma. The way her body was responding to the trauma and the telling of that secret for the first time was to lose consciousness and fall asleep. I was dumbfounded by what I had witnessed. The connection between Lee's trauma and the emerging of that secret for the first time had caused the seizure-like episode. The happy ending was that after Lee started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma healing therapy, the drop attack stopped as the trauma resolved, and she had a toolkit full of strategies that she could apply to her day-to-day life. She did not need medication to heal this wound. As you can imagine, this was a profound experience for me as a developing psychologist. I had witnessed firsthand the brain-behavior disconnection when psychological trauma impacts physical well-being. And it caused me to ask, what happens in the brain when trauma strikes and memories of it reoccur? What makes some people more susceptible to being hurt by a traumatic event while others seem resilient to it? These questions get at the very heart of why I became a psychologist in the first place. Ever since I worked with emotionally disturbed girls at a wilderness school in Virginia many years ago, I have been concerned about the effects of trauma on children and adults. I've observed trauma as a sort of psychological virus that all too often turns victims into aggressors and perpetrators of conflict and violence. Unresolved trauma and chronic stress are some of the primary reasons that people have non-epileptic events. It is also one of the main reasons that people engage in behaviors that are harmful to themselves and others. The other part of my professional practice is called forensic psychology. I do mental health evaluations for judges in the legal system. In this work, I see people who have been accused of breaking the law to determine whether they are mentally competent to stand trial, or whether they are not guilty because of severe psychiatric problems such as schizophrenia or a severe cognitive impairment. I listen carefully to defendants' life stories and what they believe happened at the time of the crime. And then I write a report for the judge about the defendant's mental status and how best to proceed given the possibility that the mental disorder may interfere with the legal process. This work brings me into contact with defendants who have not only traumatized and shattered others' lives with physical assault, domestic violence, child abuse, and murder, but I also learn how a defendant's life has been shattered by layers and layers of trauma as a result of child abuse, domestic violence, mental illness, brain injuries, and alcohol and drug abuse. Tragedy and chronic trauma are common for defendants who typically have a history of victimization that has resulted in aggression and crimes that in turn traumatize others. I first became aware of the links between trauma, mental illness, and the criminal justice system fresh out of my professional training in 1997. I headed for the wilds of northwestern Wisconsin, where I worked as a neuropsychologist doing comprehensive evaluations with young people who had serious legal problems. Judges from across Wisconsin sent youth to our 30-day assessment center where I was part of a team of healthcare providers for evaluation, treatment planning, and consultation to the courts. My experience grew over time as I did my best to respond to the needs of these youngsters and their families. However, in 2001, I was confronted with a different sort of trauma for the very first time. On June 18, a Category F3 tornado, gosh, I've told this story so many times. A Category F3 tornado struck the town of Siren, Wisconsin, killing 3 people and injuring 16. This natural disaster was devastating for this community of 1,000 people. Being one of the relatively few mental health providers in the area, I was asked to volunteer on the Red Cross mental health intervention team. And I was eager and willing to help. However, to my surprise, I discovered that I did not know how to help these traumatized people. Even though I had lots of experience, professional training, and was familiar with the psychological ramifications of trauma, I had no model to understand what was happening to these victims. And so I didn't know how to be helpful. This was shocking to me. I didn't know what to do. From then on, I decided that I needed to know, I needed to learn, I needed to be trained to understand trauma on the ground to help victims. I wanted to learn what to do to be helpful and what not to do. I wanted to understand the mind, body, spirit connection that happens when trauma strikes and how to help victims move towards healing. Over the next couple of years, my search for an integrated model of trauma and healing got me reconnected to one of my early psychology mentors, Carolyn Holdred Hagen. Carolyn had recently completed a 2.5-year term with Mennonite Central Committee, which is an international relief, development, and peace-building organization. While living in Asia, Carolyn had provided on-the-ground trauma interventions in Sri Lankan villages after the 2004 tsunami. When I told Carolyn of my desire for a training that would allow me to be useful in traumatic circumstances, she told me about STAR. I attended my first STAR training in Virginia in October 2008 and discovered that it was everything I had hoped for. The training was led by Elaine Zook-Barge, who is the director of STAR, and included 25 participants from diverse backgrounds from the Middle East, Europe, Latin America, as well as the United States. After that experience, I decided that I wanted to bring the STAR training to Minnesota so that interested people in this region of the U.S. would have the opportunity to learn the STAR principles, models and concepts without having to travel to Virginia to attend the training. Now I'd like to spend the balance of our time explaining STAR's approach to understanding healing, and the important role of resilience in that process. The STAR training includes 3 modules, basically. Module 1 examines the continuum of stress and trauma and what happens if it's left unresolved. Module 2 explores what we refer to in STAR as the trauma healing journey. And Module 3 shows how the concepts of resilience and self-care are fundamental to healing and reconciliation. So let's take a look at that first module, which is an overview of a continuum of stress and trauma. Stress is common in everyday life. It is an automatic physical, mental, and emotional response. Stress activates our bodies, neurochemicals and hormones that energize us for action. It is a natural part of life and can be neutral, positive, or negative. But too much stress results in distress and can lead to frustration, anxiety, and dis-ease. When stress is prolonged and we have little control over it, this can lead to exhaustion, depression, and eventual burnout. Traumatic stress is an emotional wound that results from experiencing a highly stressful, horrifying event over which one feels they have no control and is threatened by injury or death to self or someone else. Trauma is when our ability to respond to threat is overwhelmed. This occurs when the level of stress in our life is greater than the level of resiliency resources. It is not limited to the medical diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, which requires professional intervention. Rather, we can all help ourselves and traumatized others understand what is happening to them, find the path to healing, and actively build resilience. No doubt, each one of us could give numerous examples of stressful and traumatic events. It is any experience or situation that is psychologically distressing and painful, and that overwhelms a person's coping abilities and leaves the person feeling powerless. This happens when natural disasters strike, such as a tornado in Siren, the earthquakes in Haiti, New Zealand, Chile, and China, the tsunami in Sri Lanka, and the floods in Pakistan, volcano eruptions in Guatemala, and hurricanes on the Gulf Coast, and closer to our home, the wildfires of northern Minnesota. Human reactions to trauma occur in response to horrifying events, such as the collapse of the 35W bridge in August 2007. I remember exactly where I was when I heard that news, and I imagine most of us in this room as well. We probably also, there were people here that know people who were impacted by that. Human-made trauma can involve international conflict that leads to terrorist acts and war that impact innocent children and families in multiple and horrifying ways. Participant-induced traumatic stress is when those who actively participate in causing stress, even in the line of duty, suffer from the psychological effects of trauma. In addition to combat veterans, this can include executioners, workers who are responsible for killing animals in shelters, torturers and abusers, law enforcement officials and criminals, people who work in acute medical clinics, and those involved with assisted suicide. Trauma often blurs the lines that separate the perpetrator from the victim, with victims experiencing the downward spiral of trauma and its chronic effects, and the perpetrator, who is also traumatized, often suffering in silence. The effects of trauma impact individuals as well as entire communities, such as the January 2010 murders in the Seward neighborhood of South Minneapolis. This occurred just several blocks from where I attend church. Historical trauma is cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma that becomes institutionalized in racism, in sexism, in generations of enduring religious intolerance, in sustained ethnic conflict, and misunderstandings related to sexual orientation. Trauma can be secondary when children and adults view repeated horrific events while watching television, and children and other family members experience secondary trauma when they witness verbal and physical conflict and violence in their homes. Parental conflict and divorce and the loss of a sense of family can have enduring traumatic effects on children if left unaddressed. Child physical, emotional, and sexual abuse have long-lasting traumatic effects. Those with chronic physical differences and mental differences often face recurrent stress and trauma in a society that is unsure how to respond to people who are different. Children can experience acute and chronic stress through bullying encounters, and at times parents experience enduring stress when they discover that their children are making poor lifestyle choices. College students well know the stress associated with academic pressures and the anxiety related to tragedies on some college campuses. Physical illness can contribute to psychological stress that interferes with the healing process. Even the inevitability of death of a loved one can cause trauma if one is not prepared for it. When unresolved chronic stress and trauma remain in the body and the mind, the individual or group often results in acting out with destructive behaviors towards others, such as inflexibility and intolerance, lack of empathy towards others, child abuse and domestic violence, criminal activity, difficulty with intimacy and blaming, repetitive conflicts, terrorism and war, and destruction of the earth. And/or an individual or group engages in acting in behaviors that are self-destructive, such as alcohol and drug abuse, overwork and underwork, eating and sleeping problems, depression, anxiety, and numbness, self-blaming, shame, and self-mutilation, or physical symptoms such as high blood pressure, chronic pain, headaches, digestive problems, and non-epileptic events. So the next question is, why don't we just get over it? Let it go, move on, buck up. Forget about it. Forgive and forget. Why do these approaches simply not work in the long run? To answer this question, in STAR we learn what happens in the brain when trauma occurs. We learn about the brain's neurochemical reactions when trauma leads to fight, flight, and freeze responses. We learn how the instinctual brain that's housed in the brainstem and the emotional part of the brain called the limbic system and the thinking and logical decision-making part of the brain called the frontal lobes no longer communicate effectively when trauma strikes and is fused into long-term memories. When the brain is faced with unpredictable traumatic events, or when the brain is required to chronically overwork, as if an endurance marathon over many, many years, it is virtually impossible to remove all of the physiological reactions to stress and trauma. Without awareness, knowledge, and interventions that actively work towards healing the psychological trauma, it does not leave the body. What's interesting, as far as we know at present, these same physical and neurochemical responses to stress and trauma are cross-culturally similar. We have them all in common. There may be variations dependent on cultural learnings and expectations, but it appears that these physiological mechanisms are common to all humans regardless of race or ethnicity. In this module, we explore the interconnected cycles of violence that show that when trauma strikes and victimhood results, this often leads to fantasies of revenge, which in turn can lead to victims entering the aggressor cycle because of the belief that violence towards the other will be redemptive. This in turn just leads to more aggression and violence, which then can lead to more trauma and victimhood. And these interconnected cycles repeat themselves again and again and again. At STAR we ask, does it have to be this way? Can individuals, communities, and societies make the choice to transform great suffering into great wisdom? Can trauma be seen as an invitation to spiritual, emotional, and societal transformation? If we say yes, the resulting journey is spiritual work of the deepest sort. The journey leads into the depths of ourselves as individuals and groups, and here we come face to face with our own darkness. And in this unlikely place, grace abounds and transformation and hope begin. In Module 2 of the STAR training, the trauma healing journey shows how we break the cycles of violence and victimhood by first acknowledging the presence of those repetitive acting in and acting out behaviors that are associated with the victim-aggressor cycle. The figure 8 that you saw on the couple of slides ago is folded in on itself for the acting in and acting out behaviors here. Here, the cycles of violence presented on the previous slide are similar. As in the previous diagram, the trauma healing journey fully acknowledges when trauma and violence begin, and that this causes a cascade of automatic physiological changes in the body And these changes typically lead to feelings of loss and panic. And all too often, suppression of grief and fear occurs. Intense anger and spiritual questions are not uncommon. And the deep-seated need for justice that is in each one of us commonly leads to fantasies of revenge. One's mind often adopts a good versus evil narrative about who is to blame and why. This, in turn, translates into acts of justified aggression in the name of self-defense. And as described in the victim-aggressor model, this can cause additional layers of trauma and violence towards others as well as self-harm. And this spins on and on and on unless an individual or group makes a deliberate decision to choose a different path that does not result in more trauma. STAR's healing journey proposes a way out. Proposes a way out of this never-ending cycle of violence. This path begins by first clearly identifying the importance of finding safety. Being safe then allows for decision-making to break free from the past harmful acting in and acting out behaviors. Instead, allows for choosing to engage in resilience behaviors that promote life. The trauma healing journey acknowledges the essential role of mourning and grieving. It discovers ways to accept the reality of loss, of what was and is no more. It helps meaningfully memorialize what has been lost. It intentionally creates space for tolerance and coexistence that promotes respect for self and, in some cases, the offender. At times, the healing journey involves engaging directly with the offender. The healing journey considers the option of forgiveness by exploring what it means to forgive and what forgiveness is not. It respects the innate human need for justice and examines what needs to happen so that the victim's needs are truly met. The healing journey discovers how to integrate the truth of the trauma into one's identity in a manner that promotes healing. Together, this journey's ultimate goal is the possibility of reconciliation with self and others for healthy individuals and societies. At STAR, we refer to the trauma healing journey as the snail model, not only because of its shape, but more importantly because the journey is typically a slow, deliberate, and often messy process. At STAR, we discuss choosing the trauma healing journey accompanied by concepts along the way of truth, mercy, justice, and peace, and their relationship to each other. Often, I think of these concepts as directions on a compass as we navigate along the healing path. At STAR, we examine the concept of truth as honest acknowledgement of what happened in the trauma. We explore how different cultures, religious, and ethnic groups practice truth-telling through rituals, storytelling, memorializing, art, and music. We explore the concept of mercy, or as I like to call, active compassion, with deliberate reflection, with deliberate reflection to understand the root causes of the trauma if possible. We examine what intentional risk-taking means and what it truly means to forgive. Not simply accepting that old adage of forgive and forget. Instead, we consider the option to forgive as remembering and changing that can lead to true healing. At STAR, we hear and see stories of how others have faced personal tragedy, have overcome the trauma through a deliberate process that honors themselves, their pain, and what they need to experience transformative healing without demonizing the other. The next part of the second module of STAR, we explore the concept of justice by first examining what is commonly thought of as justice in most societies. This is called retributive justice, and it asks the questions, what wrong was done? Who is to blame? And what should be the punishment for the offender? Then we explore an alternative to retributive justice, which is called restorative justice. This system of justice also asks what wrong is done, but then it focuses on who has been hurt and what are the victim's needs? Who is responsible for making things right? And what needs to be done to make things right for the victim? As you can see, restorative justice seeks to directly help the victim heal, rather than primarily spending time and energy on blaming and punishing the offender. In the restorative justice process, healing is then possible for the victim, the community that surrounds the victim, and in some cases, the offender, thereby reducing the chance of reoffense. Finally, in Module 2, we examine what peace in action means. Most people have a preferred way of responding to conflict because of the desire for peace at any cost. There are 3 common ways of responding to conflict. The first is, let me just avoid it. Let me just pretend like it's not happening, okay? The second is accommodating the violence and conflict that then typically results in more victimization. And the third is responding to the violence and conflict with more aggression that then just serves to perpetuate that victim-aggressor cycle. In STAR, we explore an alternative to these 3 generally unsatisfying ways to achieve peace. We do that by taking a look at what does it mean to be actively nonviolent. Active nonviolence is a process that holds 2 realities in tension. It says, I will not cooperate with your aggression, your injustice, and your violence. I will resist it with every fiber of my being, while at the same time, I respect you as a human being as we negotiate a solution. STAR believes that this is where we find the path to reconciliation. This is where we find authentic peace. The trauma healing journey is not a linear 12-step program. It is an experimental process that is often fraught with trial and error discovery that combines truth, mercy, justice, and peace with the goal of healing and the possibility of reconciliation. To give you an example of how the principles of STAR were helpful in response to a traumatic story, traumatic circumstances, I have another story for you. On December 9, 2007, David and Marie Works and their daughters were leaving a worship service at the New Life Church in Colorado Springs when they came to an emotional and spiritual crossroads. A 24-year-old church worker by the name of Matthew Murray shot 2 of the Works' daughters to death. David explained, I heard a loud crack. We were evidently the first people that Murray saw. We were caught off guard. It was sheer terror. Armed with a semi-automatic rifle, Murray fired into the van, killing Works' 18-year-old daughter, Stephanie, and their 16-year-old daughter, Rachel. David was shot twice, but survived. The entire shooting lasted 7 long minutes. Murray then charged into the church, spraying gunfire and wounding 1 person before fatally shooting himself. David and Marie and their family wrestled with intense grief. They were familiar with the STAR principles because of a training that David had attended at the Center for Justice and Peace building, and they knew they had an important decision to make. They decided that they did not want to go down the road of revenge and redemptive violence. Instead, they chose to follow the healing path and eventually forgave Marie. They used the STAR principles to understand their rage and anger, and over time they worked to come to terms with the tragedy. In the months that followed the shooting, the Works family met and grew close with Murray's family, who were also traumatized. David and Marie's story show us the rawness of dealing with loss after a violent event. No doubt they were vulnerable to those acting in and acting out behaviors of the victim-aggressor cycles. But because they understood the normal reactions to trauma and knew there was a different way that would lead to healing and reconciliation for themselves and others, the tremendous power of the healing journey navigating with truth, mercy, justice, and peace enabled this family to get beyond their grief and sorrow and move towards reconciliation. The final module of STAR shows us how resilience and self-care are essential for healing. In this module, we define resilience as the ability to bend but not break. We also explore what is the difference between compassion satisfaction, which are the good thoughts and feelings that one experiences when they know they've helped someone in need, versus compassion fatigue, which is when you become worn out, psychologically depleted, and negatively impacted by helping others over time. We see resilience as not only the courage to come back, but rather together we explore the various ways to fortify ourselves on a daily basis with proactive behaviors so that when inevitable traumas strike, we have the resilience to bend but not break. These include practices and behaviors that are familiar to most of us, such as developing positive social networks, practicing meditation and yoga, making sure we get plenty of sleep, expressing our feelings, to name a few. They create resilience that increases our capacity to help ourselves and others so that we will have the necessary resources to assist others as they move through their path of healing. When we do this as individuals, together we create and promote healthy families and groups, and communities and societies. Instead of working alone and solely for one's own interests, we benefit from working together for the benefit of all, so that personal and community security translates into human security for all. So that is a brief overview of what is encompassed in the 5-day STAR workshop. You may be asking, who should participate in the STAR workshop? As I've been sharing about STAR with various groups during the past year, and as a result of the first Minneapolis STAR workshop that was held last June, I have learned how the STAR principles are applicable to parents, healthcare providers and mental health care providers, refugees and immigrants and those who work with those populations, children and adolescents, high school and college students, administrators, mediators, and community workers, attorneys and those who work in the criminal justice system, combat veterans, and those who work to help combat veterans, as well as leaders of various religious groups. Although STAR was originally developed at the Center for Justice and Peace Building, which is associated with the Christian tradition, STAR is not a Christian program per se. It actively seeks to be inclusive of and learn from multiple religious traditions, as well as from participants who do not ascribe to any particular religious or faith tradition. STAR is a compass, not a map, as we negotiate the difficulties and traumas of life. It is a deliberate process that actively seeks alternatives to violence that are creative and compassionate and promote healing and the development of resilience for individuals and communities. So let's remember that in this life, there is no predetermined path to healing, peace, and reconciliation. But together, we make the path by walking. Now I'd like to take just a few more minutes to share about the first STAR-Minneapolis workshop last June. The learning happened through presentations, physical movement, creative expression, thought-provoking, structured interactions between participants, multimedia presentations, body work, meditations from different spiritual traditions, and reflections that were woven into the experience. Our group included 28% persons of color from the Somali, Native American, African American, and Hmong communities, The GBLT community was also represented, and the ages range from the 20s to over 60. The religious traditions were Islam, Buddhist, Christian, shamanism, Native American, and those that considered themselves not affiliated with a particular religion. Professional backgrounds included several social workers, as you've heard, and mental health workers, a radio host, 2 attorneys, legal assistant from a law school, an administrator from an International Peace Institute, several graduate students from the Humphrey Institute for Public Policy, as you know, a crisis nursery social worker who worked on the Thai-Burma border, a Vietnam veteran, several restorative justice volunteers, Mennonite pastor, a nurse specializing in sexual assault examinations, an assistant director of a university multicultural center, a teacher who works with children that are hearing impaired, and a preschool teacher who works with traumatized immigrant children. Since then, many of the STAR alums have shared with me the creative ways that they are finding to apply the STAR principles in their life and work, and you heard 2 of those folks tonight. Among our group here tonight, there is probably about 6, maybe 8 to 10 STAR alums. So please feel free to talk with them after if you have more specific questions. When the June workshop was over, to be honest with you, I thought I was going to be able to return to normal life. But I had people contacting me wondering, well, when's this next STAR-Minneapolis workshop going to happen? And people that took the STAR workshop sent me cards and called me and said, I have friends that want to take this. When are you going to have the next one? Go for it. What help do you need? So I thought, okay, what help do I need? So I gathered a group of people around me, some STAR alums as well as some other community people that said, we want to see this come to life. We want to see this get launched. And this is the next step in that journey to get this launched. As some of you know from the materials that we have on the table, there are 2 STAR workshops that are planned in 2011, one in June and the other in September. Our goal is to fill both workshops to capacity. This workshop is for professionals, paraprofessionals, as well as lay volunteers. As before, we are absolutely committed to ensuring economic and cultural diversity in each of the workshops. Already, I have had several people contact me who are in need of scholarships to participate in STAR. One of these people, and she gave me permission to share her story, some of you know, Mary Johnson from North Minneapolis. Mary Johnson has she was going to be here tonight. I called her the other day and told her I'd like to use her story, and she said, absolutely. And I want to be there, but I have to be in my home community because we're having a big rally about gun violence at one of the local churches. And I said, that's important, do that. Mary, if you don't know Mary's story, after forgiving the man who killed her son and addressing the trauma of her son's murder through a restorative justice process, Mary started groups for parents of murder victims and perpetrators in her community so that they can find healing together. I met Mary last October when she saw the STAR presentation at a restorative justice conference where I shared STAR. After the presentation, Mary came up to me and she said, Donna, we need STAR in North Minneapolis. We need what you're teaching. Please keep doing STAR. I want to give Mary and others like her who are doing grassroots healing and reconciliation in our communities, like the 2 women that you heard tonight and the other STAR alums that are here. I want to be able to give them scholarships or some kind of financial assistance. If you have financial resources and or you know others that have financial resources and that would be interested in helping with STAR's Scholarship and Development Fund, we would gratefully welcome your contributions. Our goal for this year is to raise $10,000 for scholarships and development. In addition, there are other ways that you can be helpful to STAR as we move forward. One is, if you have an organization that you think would like to learn more about STAR, invite me to come and do a version of this presentation. If you have an organization that you say, my organization will partner with you, then we would like to have them as a partner. We'd invite any of you to attend one of the 2 STAR trainings. Whether or not you can attend, if you can sponsor somebody else to attend the workshop, that would be also wonderful. If you are on Facebook, friend STAR-Minneapolis on Facebook so we can spread the word. If you have skills or talents or other things to do that could help STAR get the word out and share STAR in our communities, please do that. One of our advisory committee members put me on to the Pepsi Challenge grant making program that encourages small grassroots organizations like this to make grants and then have other people in the community vote online saying this needs to be funded. So we're looking at that for coming this spring. If you have other ideas about how to be helpful with STAR, we welcome that information.